Welcome to the Enchanted Stories Podcast, taking you on magical journeys and thrilling adventures. I'm your storyteller, Russell J. Fellows. Season 1, Episode 2, The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. Chapters 9 through 16. Chapter 9, The Hall of the Goblin Palace. A sound of many soft feet followed, but soon ceased. Then Curdie flew at the hole like a tiger, and tore and pulled. The sides gave way, and it was soon large enough for him to crawl through. He would not betray himself by rekindling his lamp, but the torches of the retreating company, which he found departing in a straight line up a long avenue from the door of their cave, threw back light enough to afford him a glance round the deserted home of the goblins. To his surprise, he could discover nothing to distinguish it from an ordinary natural cave in the rock, upon many of which he had come with the rest of the miners in the progress of their excavations. The goblins had talked of coming back for the rest of their household gear. He saw nothing that would have made him suspect a family had taken shelter there for a single night. The floor was rough and stony, the walls full of projecting corners, the roof in one place 20 feet high, and another endangering his forehead, while on one side a stream no thicker than a needle, it is true, but still sufficient to spread a wide dampness over the wall, flowed down the face of the rock. But the troop in front of him was toiling under heavy burdens. He could distinguish Helfer now and then in the flickering light and shade, with his heavy chest on his bending shoulders, while the second brother was almost buried in what looked like a great feather bed. "Where do they get all the feathers?" thought Curdie. But in a moment the troop disappeared at a turn of the way, and it was now both safe and necessary for Curdie to follow them, lest they should be round the next turning before he saw them again, for so he might lose them altogether. He darted after them like a greyhound. When he reached the corner and looked cautiously round, he saw them again at some distance down another long passage. None of the galleries he saw that night bore signs of the work of man or of goblin either. Stalactites, far older than the mines, hung from their roofs, and their floors were rough with boulders and large round stones, showing that there water must have once run. He waited again at this corner till they had disappeared round the next, and so followed them a long way through one passage after another. The passages grew more and more lofty, and were more and more covered in the roof with shining stalactites. It was a strange enough procession which he followed, but the strangest part of it was the household animals which crowded amongst the feet of the goblins. It was true that they had no wild animals down there, at least they did not know of any, but they had a wonderful number of tame ones. I must, however, reserve any contributions toward the natural history of these for a later position in my story. At length, turning a corner too abruptly, he had almost rushed into the middle of the goblin family, for there they had already set down all their burdens on the floor of a cave considerably larger than that which they had left. They were as yet too breathless to speak, else he would have had warning of their arrest. He started back, however, before anyone saw him, and retreating a good way, stood watching till the father should come out to go to the palace. Before very long, both he and his son Helfer appeared, and kept on in the same direction as before, while Curdie followed them again with renewed precaution. For a long time he heard no sound except something like the rush of a river inside the rock, but at length what seemed the far-off noise of great shouting reached his ears, which, however, presently ceased. After advancing a good way farther, he thought he heard a single voice, It sounded clearer and clearer as he went on, until at last he could almost distinguish the words. In a moment or two, keeping after the goblins round another corner, he once more started back, this time in amazement. He was at the entrance of a magnificent cavern, of an oval shape, once probably a huge natural reservoir of water, now the great palace hall of the goblins. It rose to a tremendous height, but the roof was composed of such shining materials, and the multitude of torches carried by the goblins who crowded the floor lighted up the place so brilliantly that Curry could see to the top quite well. But he had no idea how immense the place was until his eyes had got accustomed to it, which was not for a good many minutes. The rough projections on the walls and the shadows thrown upwards from them by the torches made the sides of the chamber look as if they were crowned with statues upon brackets and pedestals, reaching in irregular tiers from floor to roof. The walls themselves were, in many parts, of gloriously shining substances, some of them gorgeously colored besides, which powerfully contrasted with the shadows. Curdy could not help wondering whether his rhymes would be of any use against such a multitude of goblins as filled the floor of the hall, and indeed felt considerably tempted to begin his shout of 1, 2, 3. But as there was no reason for routing them, and much for endeavoring to discover their designs, he kept himself perfectly quiet, and peering round the edge of the doorway, listened with both his sharp ears. At the other end of the hall, high above the heads of the multitude, was a terrace-like ledge of considerable height, caused by the receding of the upper part of the cavern wall. Upon this sat the king in his court, the king on a throne hollowed out of a huge block of green copper ore, and his court upon lower seats around it. The king had been making them a speech, and the applause which followed it was what Curdy had heard. One of the court was now addressing the multitude. What he heard him say was to the following effect. "Hence it appears that two plans have been for some time together working in the strong head of His Majesty for the deliverance of his people. Regardless of the fact that we were the first possessors of the regions they now inhabit, regardless equally of the fact that we abandoned that region from the loftiest motives, regardless also of the self-evident fact that we excel them so far in mental ability as they excel us in stature, they look upon us as a degraded race and make a mockery of all our finer feelings. But the time has almost arrived when, thanks to His Majesty's inventive genius, it will be in our power to take a thorough revenge upon them once for all in respect of their unfriendly behavior." "May it please your Majesty," cried a voice close by the door, which Curdy recognized as that of the goblin he had followed. "Who is that interrupts the Chancellor?" cried another from near the throne. "Glump," answered several voices. "He is our trusty subject," said the king himself, in a slow and stately voice. "Let him come forward and speak." A lane was parted through the crowd, and Glump, having ascended the platform and bowed to the king, spoke as follows. "Sire, I would have held my peace had I not known that I only knew how near was the moment to which the Chancellor had just referred. In all probability, before another day is past, the enemy will have broken through into my house, the partition between being even now not more than a foot in thickness." Not quite so much, thought Curdy to himself. This very evening I have had to remove my household effects, Therefore, the sooner we are ready to carry out the plan for the execution of which His Majesty has been making such magnificent preparations, the better. I may just add that within the last few days I have perceived a small outbreak in my dining room, which, combined with the observations upon the course of the river escaping where the evil men enter, has convinced me that close to the spot must be a deep gulf in its channel. This discovery will, I trust, add considerably to the otherwise immense forces at His Majesty's disposal." He ceased, and the king graciously acknowledged his speech with a bend of his head, whereupon Glump, after a bow to His Majesty, slid down amongst the rest of the undistinguished multitude. Then the Chancellor rose and resumed. "The information which the worthy Glump has given us," he said, "might have been of considerable import at the present moment, but for that other design already referred to, which naturally takes precedence. His Majesty, unwilling to proceed to extremities, and well aware that such measures sooner or later result in violent reactions, excogitated a more fundamental and comprehensive measure, of which I need say no more. Should His Majesty be successful, and who dares to doubt, then a peace all to the advantage of the Goblin Kingdom will be established for a generation at least, rendered absolutely secure by the pledge which His Royal Highness the Prince will have and hold for the good behavior of her relatives. Should His Majesty fail, which who shall dare even to imagine in his most secret thoughts, then will be the time for carrying out with rigor the design to which Glump referred, and for which our preparations are even now all but completed. The failure of the former will render the latter imperative." Curdie, perceiving that the assembly was drawing to a close, and that there was little chance of either plan being more fully discovered, now thought it prudent to make his escape before the goblins began to disperse, and slipped quietly away. There was not much danger of meeting any goblins, for all the men at least were left behind him in the palace. But there was considerable danger of his taking a wrong turning, for he had now no light, and had therefore to depend upon his memory and his hands. After he had left behind him the glow that issued from the door of Glump's new abode, he was utterly without guide, so far as his eyes were concerned. He was most anxious to get back through the hole before the goblins should return to fetch the remains of their furniture. It was not that he was in the least afraid of them, but as it was of the utmost importance that he should thoroughly discover what the plans they were cherishing were, he must not occasion the slightest suspicion that they were watched by a miner. He hurried on, feeling his way along the walls of rock. Had he not been very courageous, he must have been very anxious, for he could not but know that if he lost his way, it would be the most difficult thing in the world to find it again. Morning would bring no light into these regions, and towards him least of all, who was known as the special rhymester and persecutor, could goblins be expected to exercise courtesy. Well might he wish that he had brought his lamp and tinderbox with him, of which he had not thought when he crept so eagerly after the goblins. He wished it all the more when, after a while, he found his way blocked up, and could get no farther. It was of no use to turn back, for he had not the least idea where he had begun to go wrong. Mechanically, however, he kept feeling about the walls that hemmed him in. His hand came upon a place where a tiny stream of water was running down the face of the rock. "What a stupid I am," he said to himself. "I am actually at the end of my journey. And there are the goblins coming back to fetch their things," he added, as the red glimmer of their torches appeared at the end of the long avenue that led up to the cave. In a moment he had thrown himself at the floor and wriggled backwards through the hole. The floor on the other side was several feet lower, which made it easier to get back. It was all he could do to lift the largest stone he had taken out of the hole, but he did manage to shove it in again. He sat down on the ore heap and thought. He was pretty sure that the latter plan of the goblins was to inundate the mine by breaking outlets for the water accumulated in the natural reservoirs of the mountain, as well as running through portions of it, while the part hollowed by the miners remained shut off from that inhabited by the goblins. They had had no opportunity of injuring them thus. But now that the passage was broken through, and the goblins' part proved the higher in the mountain, it was clear to Curdie that the mine could be destroyed in an hour. Water was always the chief danger to which the miners were exposed. They met with little choke damp sometimes, but never with the explosive fire damp so common in coal mines. Hence they were careful as soon as they saw any appearance of water. As the result of his reflections while the goblins were busy in their old home, it seemed to Curdie that it would be best to build up the whole of his gang, filling it with stone and clay or lye, so that there should be no smallest channel for the water to get into. There was not, however, any immediate danger, for the execution of the goblins' plan was contingent upon the failure of that unknown design, which was to take precedence of it. And he was most anxious to keep the door of communication open, that he might, if possible, discover what the former plan was. At the same time, they could not resume their intermitted labors for the inundation without his finding it out, when by putting all hands to the work, the one existing outlet might in a single night be rendered impenetrable to any weight of water. For by filling the gang entirely up, their embankment would be buttressed by the sides of the mountain itself. As soon as he found that the goblins had again retired, he lighted his lamp and proceeded to fill the hole he had made with such stones as he could withdraw when he pleased. He then thought it better, as he might have occasion to be up a good many nights after this, to go home and have some sleep. How pleasant the night air felt upon the outside of the mountain after what he had gone through in the inside of it. He hurried up the hill without meeting a single goblin on the way, and called and tapped at the window until he woke his father, who soon rose and let him in. He told him the whole story, and just as he had expected, his father thought it best to work the load no farther, but at the same time to pretend occasionally to be at work there still, in order that the goblins might have no suspicions. Both father and son then went to bed and slept soundly until the morning. Chapter 10. The Princess's King Papa. The weather continued fine for weeks, and the little princess went out every day. So long a period of fine weather had indeed never been known upon that mountain. The only uncomfortable thing was that her nurse was so nervous and particular about being in before the sun was down, that often she would take her to heels when nothing worse than a fleecy cloud crossing the sun threw a shadow on the hillside. And many an evening they were home a full hour before the sunlight had left the weathercock on the stables. If it had not been for such odd behavior, Irene would have by this time almost forgotten the goblins. She never forgot Curdie, but him she remembered for his own sake, and indeed would have remembered him if only because a princess never forgets her debts until they are paid. One splendid sunshiny day, about an hour after noon, Irene, who was playing on a lawn in the garden, heard the distant blast of a bugle. She jumped up with a cry of joy, for she knew by that particular blast that her father was on his way to see her. This part of the garden lay on a slope of a hill, and allowed a full view of the country below. So she shaded her eyes with her hand, and looked far away to catch the first glimpse of shining armor. In a few moments, a little troop came glittering round the shoulder of a hill. Spears and helmets were sparkling and gleaming, banners were flying, horses prancing, and again came the bugle blast, which was to her like the voice of her father calling across the distance, "Irene, I'm coming!" On and on they came, until she could clearly distinguish the king. He rode a white horse, and was taller than any of the men with him. He wore a narrow circle of gold set with jewels around his helmet, and as he came still nearer, Irene could discern the flashing of the stones in the sun. It was a long time since he had been to see her, and her little heart beat faster and faster as the shining troop approached. For she loved her King Papa very dearly, and was nowhere so happy as in his arms. When they reached a certain point, after which she could see them no more from the garden, she ran to the gate, and there stood till up they came, clanging and stamping, with one more bright bugle blast which said, "Irene, I am come." By this time the people of the house were all gathered at the gate, but Irene stood alone in the front of them. When the horseman pulled up, she ran up to the side of the white horse and held up her arms. The king stopped and took her hands, and in an instant she was on the saddle and clasped in his great strong arms. I wish I could describe the king so that you could see him in your mind. He had gentle blue eyes, but a nose that made him look like an eagle. A long dark beard, streaked with silvery lines, flowed from his mouth almost to his waist, and as Irene sat on his saddle and hid her glad face upon his bosom, it mingled with the golden hair which her mother had given her, and the two were like a cloud with streaks of the sun woven through it. After he had held her to his heart for a minute, he spoke to his white horse, and the great beautiful creature, which had been prancing so proudly a little while before, walked as gently as a lady, for he knew he had a little lady on his back, through the gate and up to the door of the house. The king set her on the ground, and, dismounting, took her hand and walked with her into the great hall, which was hardly ever entered except when he came to see his little princess. There he sat down with two of his counselors who had accompanied him, to have some refreshment, and Irene sat on his right hand and drank her milk out of a wooden bowl curiously carved. After the king had eaten and drunk, he turned to the princess and said, stroking her hair, "Now, my child, what shall we do next?" This was the question he almost always put to her first after their meal together, and Irene had been waiting for it with some impatience, for now, she thought, she should be able to settle a question which constantly perplexed her. "I should like you to take me to see my great old grandmother." The king looked grave and said, "What does my little daughter mean?" "I mean the Queen Irene that lives up in the tower, the very old lady, you know, with the long hair of silver." The king only gazed at his little princess with a look she could not understand. "She's got her crown in her bedroom," she went on, "but I've not been in there yet. You know she's there, don't you?" "No," said the king very quietly. "Then it must all be a dream," said Irene. "I half thought it was, but I couldn't be sure. Now I am sure of it. Besides, I couldn't find her the next time I went up." At that moment, a snow-white pigeon flew in at an open window, and settled upon Irene's head. She broke into a merry laughter, cowered a little, and put up her hands to her head, saying, "Dear Dovey, don't peck me. You'll pull out my hair with your long claws if you don't mind." The king stretched out his hand to take the pigeon, but it spread its wings and flew again through the open window, when its whiteness made one flash in the sun and vanished. The king laid his hand upon the princess's head, held it back a little, gazed in her face, smiled half a smile, and sighed half a sigh. "Come, my child, we'll have a walk in the garden together," he said. "You won't come up and see my huge, great, beautiful grandmother then, King Papa?" said the princess. "Not this time," said the king very gently. "She has not invited me, you know, and great old ladies like her do not choose to be visited without leave asked and given." The garden was a very lovely place. Being upon a mountainside, there were parts in it where the rocks came through in great masses, and all immediately about them remained quite wild. Tufts of heather grew upon them, and other hardy mountain plants and flowers, while near them would be lovely roses and lilies and all pleasant garden flowers. This mingling of the wild mountain with the civilized garden was very quaint, and it was impossible for any number of gardeners to make such a garden look formal and stiff. Against one of these rocks was a garden seat, shadowed from the afternoon sun by the overhanging of the rock itself. There was a little winding path up to the top of the rock, and on top another seat. But they sat on the seat at its foot because the sun was hot, and there they talked together of many things. At length the king said, "You were out late one evening, Irene." "Yes, Papa, it was my fault, and Ludi was very sorry." "I must talk to Ludi about it," said the king. "Don't speak loud to her, please, Papa," said Irene. "She's been so afraid of being late ever since. Indeed, she has not been naughty. It was only a mistake for once." "Once might be too often," murmured the king to himself, as he stroked his child's head. I can't tell you how he had come to know. I'm sure Curdie had not told him. Someone about the palace must have seen them after all. He sat for a good while, thinking. There was no sound to be heard, except that of a little stream which ran merrily out of an opening in the rock by which they sat, and sped down the hill through the garden. Then he rose, and leaving Irene where she was, went into the house and sent for Ludi, with whom he had a talk that made her cry. When in the evening he rode away upon his great white horse, he left 6 of his attendants behind him, with orders that 3 of them should watch outside the house every night, walking round and round it from sunset to sunrise. It was clear he was not quite comfortable about the princess.
Chapter 11. The Old Lady's Bedroom. Nothing more happened worth telling for some time. The autumn came and went by, and there were no more flowers in the garden. The wind blew strong and howled among the rocks. The rain fell and drenched a few yellow and red leaves that could not get off the bare branches. Again and again there would be a glorious morning, followed by a pouring afternoon, and sometimes for a week together there would be rain, nothing but rain all day, and then the most lovely, cloudless night, with the sky all out in full-blown stars, not one missing. But the princess could not see much of them, for she went to bed early. The winter drew on, and she found things growing dreary. When it was too stormy to go out, and she had got tired of her toys, Ludi would take her about the house, sometimes to the housekeeper's room, where the housekeeper, who was a good, kind old woman, made much of her, sometimes to the servants' halls or the kitchen, where she was not princess merely, but absolute queen, and ran a great risk of being spoiled. Sometimes she would run off herself to a room where the men-at-arms whom the king had left sat, and they showed her their arms and accoutrements, and did what they could to amuse her. Still, at other times, she found it very dreary, and often wished her huge great-grandmother had not been a dream. One morning the nurse left her with the housekeeper for a while. To amuse her, she had got out the contents of an old cabinet upon the table. The little princess found her treasures, queer ancient ornaments, and many things the use of which she could not imagine, far more interesting than her own toys, and she sat playing with them for 2 hours or more. But at length, in handling a curious old-fashioned brooch, she ran the pin off into her thumb, and gave a little scream of sharpness of pain, but would have thought little more of it, had not the pain increased, and her thumb began to swell. This alarmed the housekeeper greatly, and the nurse was fetched, the doctor was sent for, and her hand was poulticed, and long before her usual time she was put to bed. The pain still continued, and although she fell asleep and dreamed a good many dreams, there was the pain always in every dream. At last it woke her up. The moon was shining brightly into the room. The poultice had fallen off her hand, and it was burning hot. She fancied if she could hold it into the moonlight, that it would cool it. So she got out of bed, without waking the nurse, who lay on the other side of the room, and went to the window. When she looked out, she saw one of the men-at-arms walking in the garden with the moonlight glancing on his armor. She was just going to tap the window and call to him, for she wanted to tell him all about it, when she bethought herself that it might wake Ludi, and she would put her into bed again. So she resolved to go to the window of another room and call him from there. It was so much nicer to have somebody to talk to than to lie awake in bed with the burning pain in her hand. She opened the door very gently and went through the nursery, which did not look into the garden, to go to the other window. But when she came to the foot of the old staircase, there was the moon shining down from some window high up, and making the worm-eaten oak look very strange and delicate and lovely. In a moment she was putting her little feet one after the other in the silvery path up the stair, looking behind as she went to see the shadow they made in the middle of the silver. Some little girls would have been afraid to find themselves thus alone in the middle of the night, but Irene was a princess. As she went slowly up the stair, not quite sure that she was not dreaming, suddenly a great longing woke up in her heart to try once more whether she could find the old lady with the silvery hair. "If she is a dream," she said to herself, "then I am likelier to find her if I am dreaming." So up and up she went, stair after stair, until she came to the many rooms, all just as she had seen them before. Through passage after passage she softly sped, comforting herself that if she should lose her way, it would not matter much, because when she woke she would find herself in her own bed, with Ludi not far off. But, as if she had known every step of the way, she walked straight to the door at the foot of the narrow stair that led to the tower. "What if I should really find my beautiful old grandmother up there?" she said to herself as she crept up the steep steps. When she reached the top, she stood a moment, listening in the dark, for there was no moon there. Yes, it was the hum of the spinning wheel. What a diligent grandmother to work both day and night! She tapped gently at the door. "Come in, Irene," said the sweet voice. The princess opened the door and entered. There was the moonlight streaming in at the window, and in the middle of the moonlight sat the old lady in her black dress with the white lace and her silvery hair mingling with the moonlight, so that you could not have told which was which. "Come in, Irene," she said again. "Can you tell me what I am spinning?" "She speaks," thought Irene, "just as if she had seen me 5 minutes ago, or yesterday at the farthest." "No," she answered, "I don't know what you are spinning. Please, I thought you were a dream. Why couldn't I find you before, great-great-grandmother?" "That you are hardly old enough to understand. But you would have found me sooner if you hadn't come to think I was a dream. I will give you one reason, though, why you couldn't find me. I didn't want you to find me." "Why, please?" "Because I did not want Ludi to know I was here." "But you told me to tell Ludi." "Yes, but I knew Ludi would not believe you. If she were to see me sitting spinning here, she wouldn't believe me either." "Why?" "Because she couldn't. She would rub her eyes and go away and say she felt queer and forgot half of it and more, and then say it had all been a dream." "Just like me," said Irene, feeling very much ashamed of herself. "Yes, a good deal like you, but not just like you. For you've come again, and Ludi wouldn't have come again. She would have said, 'No, no.' She had had enough of such nonsense." "Is it naughty of Ludi, then?" "It would have been naughty of you. I've never done anything for Ludi." "And you did wash my face and hands for me," said Irene, beginning to cry. The old lady smiled a sweet smile and said, "I'm not vexed with you, my child, nor with Ludi either. But I don't want you to say anything more to Ludi about me. If she should ask you, you must just be silent, but I do not think she will ask you." All the time they talked, the old lady kept on spinning. "You haven't told me yet what I am spinning," she said. "Because I don't know. It's very pretty stuff." It was indeed very pretty stuff. There was a good bunch of it on the distaff attached to the spinning wheel, and in the moonlight it shone like... What shall I say it was like? It was not like white enough for silver. Yes, it was like silver, but shone gray rather than white, and glittered only a little. And the thread the old lady drew out from it was so fine that Irene could hardly see it. "I am spinning this for you, my child." "For me? What am I supposed to do with it, please?" "I will tell you by and by. But first I will tell you what it is. It is a spider web, of a particular kind. My pigeons bring it to me from over the great sea. There is only one forest where the spiders live who make this particular kind, the finest and strongest of any. I have nearly finished my present job. What is on the rock now will be enough. I have a week's worth there yet, though," she added, looking at the bunch. "Do you work all day and all night too, great-great-great-great-great-grandmother?" said the princess, thinking it very polite with so many greats. "I am not quite so great as all that," she answered, smiling most merrily. "If you call me grandmother, that will do. No, I don't work every night, only moonlit nights. And then no longer than the moon shines upon my wheel. I shan't work much longer tonight." "And what will you do next, grandmother?" "Go to bed. Would you like to see my bedroom?" "Yes, that I should." "Then I think I won't work any longer tonight. I shall be in good time." The old lady rose and left her wheel standing just as it was. You see, there was no good in putting it away, for where there was not any furniture, there was no danger of being untidy. Then she took Irene by the hand, but it was her bad hand, and Irene gave a little cry of pain. "My child," said her grandmother, "what is the matter?" Irene held her hand into the moonlight that the old lady might see it, and told her all about it, at which she looked grave. But she only said, Give me your other hand. And, having let her out upon the little dark landing, opened the door on the opposite side of it. What was Irene's surprise to see the loveliest room she had ever seen in her life. It was large and lofty and dome-shaped. From the center hung a lamp as round as a ball, shining as if it was the brightest moonlight, which made everything visible in the room, though not so clearly as the princess could tell what many of the things were. A large oval bed stood in the middle, with a coverlid of rose color, and velvet curtains all around it of a lovely pale blue. The walls were also blue, spangled all over with what looked like stars of silver. The old lady left her, and going to a strange-looking cabinet, opened it and took out a curious silver casket. Then she sat down on a low chair and, calling Irene, made her kneel before her while she looked at her hand. Having examined it, she opened the casket and took from it a little ointment. The sweetest odor filled the room, like that of roses and lilies, as she rubbed the ointment gently all over the hot, swollen hand. Her touch was so pleasant and cool that it seemed to drive away the pain and heat wherever it came. "Oh, grandmother, it is so nice," said Irene. "Thank you, thank you." Then the old lady went to a chest of drawers and took out a large handkerchief of gossamer-like cambric, which she tied round her hand. "I don't think I can let you go away tonight," she said. "Would you like to sleep with me?" "Oh, yes, yes, dear grandmother," said Irene, and would have clapped her hands, forgetting that she could not. "You won't be afraid, then, to go to bed with such an old woman?" "No, you are so beautiful, grandmother." "But I am very old." "And I suppose I am very young. You won't mind sleeping with such a very young woman, grandmother?" "You sweet little pertness," said the old lady, and drew her towards her, and kissed her on the forehead and the cheek and the mouth. Then she got a large silver basin, and having poured some water into it, made Irene sit on the chair and washed her feet. This done, she was ready for bed, and oh, what a delicious bed it was into which her grandmother laid her. She hardly could have told she was lying upon anything. She felt nothing but the softness. The old lady, having undressed herself, lay down beside her. "Why don't you put out your moon?" asked the princess. "That never goes out, night or day," she answered. "In the darkest night, if any of my pigeons are out on a message, they always see my moon and know where to fly to." "But if somebody besides the pigeons were to see it, somebody about the house, I mean, they would come to look what it was and find you." "The better for them, then," said the old lady. "But it does not happen above 5 times in 100 years that anyone does see it. The greater part of those who do take it for a meteor wink their eyes and forget it again. Besides, nobody could find the room except I pleased. Besides, again, I will tell you a secret. If that light were to go out, you would fancy yourself lying on a bare garret, on a heap of old straw, and would not see one of the pleasant things round about you all the time." "I hope it will never go out," said the princess. "I hope not. But it is time we both went to sleep. Shall I take you in my arms?" The little princess nestled close up to the old lady, who took her in both arms and held her close to her bosom. "Oh dear, this is so nice," said the princess. "I didn't know anything in the world could be so comfortable. I should like to lie here forever." "You may, if you will," said the old lady. "But I must put you to one trial. Not a very hard one, I hope. This night week you must come back to me. If you don't, I do not know when you may find me again, and you will soon want me very much." "Oh, please, don't let me forget." "You shall not forget. The only question is whether you will believe I am anything but a dream." You may be sure I will do all I can to help you to come, but it will rest with yourself after all. On the night of next Friday, you must come to me, mind now." "I will try," said the princess. "Then good night," said the old lady, and kissed the forehead which lay on her bosom. In a moment more, the little princess was dreaming in the midst of the loveliest dreams of summer seas and moonlight and mossy springs and great murmuring trees and beds of wild flowers with such odors as she had never smelled before. But after all, no dream could be more lovely than what she had left behind when she fell asleep. In the morning, she found herself in her own bed. There was no handkerchief or anything else on her hand, only a sweet odor lingered about it. The swelling had all gone down, the prick of the brooch had vanished. In fact, her hand was perfectly well. Chapter 12. A short chapter about Curdie. Curdie spent many nights in the mine. His father and he had taken Mrs. Peters into the secret, for they knew Mother could hold her tongue, which was more than could be said of all the miners' wives. But Curdie did not tell her that every night he spent in the mine, part of it went into earning a new red petticoat for her. Mrs. Peterson was such a nice, good mother. All mothers are nice and good, more or less, but Mrs. Peterson was nice and good all more and no less. She made and kept a little heaven in that poor cottage on the high hillside for her husband and son to go home to out of the low and rather dreary earth in which they worked. I doubt if ever the princess was very much happier, even in the arms of her huge great-grandmother, than Peter and Curdie were in the arms of Mrs. Peterson. True, her hands were hard and chapped and large, but it was with work for them, and therefore, in the sight of the angels, her hands were so much more the beautiful. And if Curdie worked hard to get her a petticoat, she worked hard every day to get him comforts which he would have missed much more than she would a new petticoat, even in winter. Not that she and Curdie ever thought of how much they worked for each other. That would have spoiled everything. When left alone in the mine, Curdie always worked on for an hour or two at first, following the lode which, according to Glump, would lead at least into the deserted habitation. After that, he would set out on a reconnoitring expedition. In order to manage this, or rather the return from it, better than the first time, he had bought a huge ball of fine string, having learned the trick from Hop-o'-my-Thumb, whose history his mother had often told him. Not that Hop-o'-my-Thumb had ever used a ball of string. I should be sorry to be supposed so far out of my classics. But the principle was the same as that of the pebbles. The end of the string he fastened to his pickaxe, which he figured no bad anchor, and then, with the ball in his hand, unrolling as he went, set out in the dark through the natural gangs of the goblins' territory. The first night or two he came upon nothing worth remembering, saw only a little of the home life of the cobs in the various caves they called houses, failed in coming upon anything to cast light upon the foregoing design, which kept the inundation for the present in the background. But at length, I think on the third or fourth night, he found, partly guided by the noise of their implements, a company of evidently the best sappers and miners among them, hard at work. What were they about? It could not well be the inundation, seeing that they had the meantime been postponed to do something else. Then, what was it? He lurked and watched, every now and then in the greatest risk of being detected, but without success. He had again and again to retreat in haste, a proceeding rendered the more difficult that he had to gather up his string as he returned upon his course. It was not that he was afraid of goblins, but that he was afraid of their finding out that they were being watched, which might have prevented the discovery at which he aimed. Sometimes his haste had to be such that, when he reached home toward morning, his string, for lack of time to wind it up as he dodged the cobs, would be in what seemed most hopeless entanglement. But after a good sleep, though a short one, he always found his mother had got it right again. There it was, wound in a most respectable ball, ready for use the moment he should want it. "I can't think how you do it, Mother," he would say. "I just follow the thread," she would answer, "just as you do in the mine." She never had more to say about it, but the less clever she was with her words, the more clever she was with her hands, and the less her mother said, the more Gertie believed she had to say. But still, he had made no discovery as to what the goblin miners were about. Chapter 13. The Cob's Creatures. About this time, the gentlemen whom the king had left behind him to watch over the princess had each occasion to doubt the testimony of his own eyes, for more than strange were the objects to which they would bear witness. They were of one sort, creatures, but so grotesque and misshapen as to be more like the child's drawings upon the slate than anything natural. They saw them only at night, while on guard about the house. The testimony of the man who first reported having seen one of them was that, as he was walking slowly round the house, while yet in the shadow, he caught sight of a creature standing on its hind legs in the moonlight, with its forefeet upon the window ledge, staring in at the window. Its body might have been that of a dog or a wolf, he thought, but he declared on his honor that its head was twice the size it ought to have been for the size of its body, and as round as a ball, while the face, which turned upon him as it fled, was more like one carved by a boy upon the turnip, inside which he was going to put a candle, than anything else he could think of. It rushed into the garden. He sent an arrow after it, and thought he must have struck it, for it gave an unearthly howl, and he could not find his arrow any more than the beast, although he searched all about the place where it vanished. They laughed at him until he was driven to hold his tongue, and said he must have taken too long a pull at the ale-jug. But before 2 nights were over, he had one to side with him, for he, too, had seen something strange, only quite different from that reported by the other. The description the second man gave of the creature he had seen was yet more grotesque and unlikely. They were both laughed at by the rest, but night after night another came over to their side, until at last there was only one left to laugh at all his companions. 2 nights more passed, and he saw nothing. But on the third, he came rushing from the garden to the other 2 before the house, in such an agitation that they declared, for it was their turn now, that the band of his helmet was cracking under his chin with the rising of the hair inside it. Running with him into the part of the garden which I have already described, they saw a score of creatures, to not one which they could give a name, and not one of which was like another. Hideous and ludicrous at once, gambolling on the lawn in the moonlight. The supernatural, or rather subnatural ugliness of their faces, the length of legs and necks in some, the apparent absence of both or either in others, made the spectators, although in one consent as to what they saw, yet doubtful, as I have said, of the evidence of their own eyes, and ears as well, for the noises they made, although not loud, were as uncouth and varied as their forms, and could be described neither as grunts, nor squeaks, nor roars, nor howls, nor barks, nor yells, nor screams, nor croaks, nor hisses, nor mews, nor shrieks, but only as something like all of them mingled in one horrible dissonance. Keeping in the shade, the watchers had a few moments to recover themselves before the hideous assembly suspected their presence, but all at once, as if by common consent, they scampered off in the direction of the great rock, and vanished before the men had come to themselves sufficiently to think of following them. My readers will suspect what these were, but I will now give them full information concerning them. They were, of course, household animals belonging to the goblins, whose ancestors had taken their ancestors many centuries before from the upper regions of light into the lower regions of darkness. The original stocks of these horrible creatures were now very much the same as the animals now seen about the farms and homes in the country, with the exception of a few of them, which had been wild creatures, such as foxes, and indeed wolves and small bears, which the goblins, from their proclivity towards the animal creation, had caught when cubs and tamed. But in the course of time, all had undergone even greater changes than had passed upon their owners. They had altered, that is, their descendants had altered, into such creatures as I have not attempted to describe, except in the vaguest manner, the various parts of their bodies assuming, in apparently arbitrary and self-willed manner, the most abnormal developments. Indeed, so little did any distinct type predominate in some of the bewildering results that you could only have guessed at any known animal as the original, and even then, what likeness remained would be more one of general expression than of definable conformation. But what increased the gruesome tenfold was that, from constant domestic or indeed rather family association with the goblins, their countenance had grown in grotesque resemblance to the human. No one understands animals who does not see that every one of them, even amongst the fishes, and maybe with a dimness and vagueness infinitely remote, yet shadows of the human. In the case of these, the human resemblance had greatly increased. While their owners had sunk towards them, they had risen towards their owners. But the conditions of the subterranean life being equally unnatural for both, while the goblins were worse, the creatures had not improved by the approximation, and its result would have appeared far more ludicrous than consoling to the warmest lover of animal nature. I shall now explain how it was that just then these animals began to show themselves about the king's country house. The goblins, as Curdie had discovered, were mining on, at work both day and night, in divisions, urging the scheme after which he lay in wait. In the course of their tunneling, they had broken into the channel of a small stream, but the break being at the top of it, no water had escaped to interfere with their work. Some of the creatures, hovering as they often did about their masters, had found the hole, and had, with the curiosity which had grown to a passion from the restraints of their unnatural circumstances, proceeded to explore the channel. The stream was the same which ran out by the seat of which Irene and her king papa had sat, as I have told, and the goblin creatures found it jolly fun to get out for a romp on a smooth lawn, such as they never seen in their poor miserable lives. But although they had partaken enough the nature of their owners to delight in annoying and alarming any of the people whom they met on the mountain, they were, of course, incapable of designs of their own, or of intentionally furthering those of their masters. For several nights after the men-at-arms were at length of one mind as to the fact the visits of some horrible creatures, whether bodily or spectral they could not yet say, they watched with special attention that part of the garden where they had last seen them. Perhaps, indeed, they gave, in consequence, too little attention to the house. But the creatures were too cunning to be easily caught, nor were the watchers quick-eyed enough to descry the head or the keen eyes in it, which, from the opening whence the stream issued, would watch them in turn, ready when the moment they should leave the lawn to report the place clear.
Chapter 14. That Night Week. During the whole of the week, Irene had been thinking every other moment of her promise to the old lady, although even now she could not feel quite sure that she had not been dreaming. Could it really be that an old lady lived up at the top of the house, with pigeons and a spinning wheel, and a lamp that never went out? She was, however, none the less determined, on the coming Friday, to ascend the 3 stairs, walk through the passages with the many doors, and try to find the tower in which she had either seen or dreamed her grandmother. Her nurse could not help wondering what had come to the child. She would sit so thoughtfully silent, and even in the midst of a game with her, would so suddenly fall into a dreamy mood. But Irene took care to betray nothing, whatever efforts Ludi might make to get at her thoughts. And Ludi had to say to herself, "What an old child she is," and give it up. At length the longed-for Friday arrived, and lest Ludi should be moved to watch her, Irene endeavored to keep herself as quiet as possible. In the afternoon she asked for a doll's house, and went on arranging and rearranging the various rooms and their inhabitants for a whole hour. Then she gave a sigh and threw herself back in her chair. One of the dolls would not sit, and another would not stand, and they were all very tiresome. Indeed, there was one would not even lie down, which was too bad. But it was now getting dark, and the darker it got, the more excited Irene became, and the more she felt it necessary to be composed. "I see you want your tea, Princess," said the nurse. "I will go and get it. The room feels close. I will open the window a little. The evening is mild. It won't hurt you." "There's no fear of that, Ludi," said Irene, wishing she had put off going for the tea till it was darker, when she might have made her attempt with every advantage. I fancy Ludi was longer in returning than she had intended, for when Irene, who had been lost in thought, looked up, she saw it was nearly dark, and at the same moment caught sight of a pair of eyes, bright with green light, glowering at her through the open window. The next instant something leaped into the room. It was like a cat, with legs as long as horses, Irene said, but its body no bigger and its legs no thicker than those of a cat. She was too frightened to cry out, but not too frightened to jump up from her chair and run from the room. It is plain enough to every one of my readers what she ought to have done, and indeed Irene thought of it herself, but when she came to the foot of the old stair, just outside the nursery door, she imagined the creature running up those long ascents after her, and pursuing her through the dark passages, which, after all, might lead to no tower. That thought was too much. Her heart failed her, and turning from the stair, she rushed along the hall, whence, finding the front door open, she darted into the court, pursued, at least she thought so, by the creature. No one happening to see her, on she ran, unable to think for fear, and ready to run anywhere to elude the awful creature with the stilt legs. Not daring to look behind her, she rushed straight out of the gate and up the mountain. It was foolish indeed thus to run farther and farther from all who could help her, as if she had been seeking a fit spot for the goblin creature to eat her in his leisure. But that is the way fear serves us. It always sides with the thing we are afraid of. The princess was soon out of breath with running uphill, but she ran on, for she fancied the horrible creature just behind her, forgetting that, had it been after her, such long legs as those must have overtaken her long ago.
At last she could run no longer, and fell, unable even to scream, by the roadside, where she lay for some time, half dead with terror. But finding nothing lay hold of her, and her breath beginning to come back, she ventured at length to get half up and peer anxiously about her. It was now so dark she could see nothing. Not a single star was out. She could not even tell what direction the house lay, and between her and the home she fancied the dreadful creature lying ready to pounce upon her. She saw now that she ought to have run up the stairs at once. It was well she did not scream, for although very few of the goblins had come out for weeks, a stray idler or two might have heard her. She sat down upon a stone, and nobody but one who had done something wrong could have been more miserable. She had quite forgotten her promise to visit her grandmother. A raindrop fell upon her face. She looked up, and for a moment her terror was lost in astonishment. At first she thought the rising moon had left her place, and drawn nigh to see what could be the matter with the little girl, sitting alone, without hat or cloak, on the dark bare mountain. But soon she saw she was mistaken, for there was no light on the ground at her feet, and no shadow anywhere. But a great silver globe was hanging in the air, and as she gazed at the lovely thing, her courage revived. If she were but indoors again, she would fear nothing, not even the terrible creature with the long legs. But how was she to find her way back? What could that light be? Could it be? No, it couldn't. But what if it should be? Yes, it must be her great-great-grandmother's lamp, which guided her pigeons home through the darkest night. She jumped up. She had but to keep that light in view, and she must find the house. Her heart grew strong. Speedily, yet softly, she walked down the hill, hoping to pass the watching creature unseen. Dark as it was, there was little danger now of choosing the wrong road, and, which was most strange, the light that filled her eyes from the lamp, instead of blinding them for a moment to the object upon which they fell, enabled her for a moment to see it, despite the darkness. By looking at the lamp and then dropping her eyes, she could see the road for a yard or two in front of her, and this saved her from several falls, for the road was very rough. But all at once, to her dismay, it vanished, and the terror of the beast, which had left her the moment she began to return, again laid hold of her heart. The same instant, however, she caught the light of the windows, and knew exactly where she was. It was too dark to run, but she made what haste she could, and reached the gate in safety. She found the house door still open, ran through the hall, and, without even looking into the nursery, bounded straight up the stair, and the next, and the next, then turning to the right, ran through the long avenue of silent rooms, and found her way at once to the door at the foot of the tower stair. When first the nurse missed her, she fancied she was playing her a trick, and for some time took no trouble about her. But at last, getting frightened, she had begun to search, and when the princess entered, the whole household was hither and thither over the house, hunting for her. A few seconds after she reached the stair of the tower, they had even begun to search the neglected rooms, in which they would never have thought of looking, had they not already searched every other place they could think of in vain. But by this time she was knocking at the old lady's door.
Chapter 15. Woven and then Spun. "Come in, Irene," said the silvery voice of her grandmother. The princess opened the door and peeped in, but the room was quite dark, and there was no sound of the spinning wheel. She grew frightened once more, thinking that, although the room was there, the old lady might be a dream after all. Every little girl knows how dreadful it is
to find her room empty where she thought somebody was. But Irene had to fancy for a moment that the person she came to find was nowhere at all. She remembered, however, that at night she spun only in the moonlight, and concluded that must be why there was no sweet bee-like humming. The old lady might be somewhere in the darkness. Before she had time to think another thought, she heard her voice again, saying as before, "Come in, Irene." From the sound, she understood at once that she was not in the room beside her. Perhaps she was in her bedroom. She turned across the passage, feeling her way to the other door. When her hand fell on the lock, again the old lady spoke. "Shut the other door behind you, Irene. I always close the door of my workroom when I go to my chamber." Irene wondered to hear her voice so plainly through the door. Having shut the other, she opened it and went in. Oh, what a lovely haven to reach from the darkness and fear through which she had come! The soft light made her feel as if she were going into the heart of the milkiest pearl, while the blue walls and their silver stars for a moment perplexed her with the fancy that they were in reality the sky which she had left outside a minute ago, covered with rain clouds. "I've lighted a fire for you, Irene. You're cold and wet," said her grandmother. Then Irene looked again, and saw that what she had taken for a huge bouquet of red roses on a low stand against the wall was in fact a fire which burned in the shapes of the loveliest and reddest roses, glowing gorgeously between the heads and wings of two cherubs of shining silver. And when she came nearer, she found that the smell of roses with which the room was filled came from the fire roses on the hearth. Her grandmother was dressed in the loveliest pale blue velvet, over which her hair, no longer white, but of a rich golden color, streamed like a cataract, here falling in dull gathered heaps, there rushing away in smooth shining falls. And ever as she looked, the hair seemed pouring down from her head and vanishing in a golden mist ere it reached the floor. It flowed from under the edge of a circle of shining silver, set with alternated pearls and opals. On her dress was no ornament whatever, neither was there a ring on her hand, or a necklace or carcanet about her neck. But her slippers glimmered with the light of the Milky Way, for they were covered with seed pearls and opals in one mass. Her face was that of a woman of 23. The princess was so bewildered with astonishment and admiration that she could hardly thank her, and drew nigh with timidity, feeling dirty and uncomfortable. The lady was seated on a low chair by the side of the fire, with hands outstretched to take her, but the princess hung back with a troubled smile. "Why, what's the matter?" asked her grandmother. "You haven't been doing anything wrong. I know that by your face, though it is rather miserable. What's the matter, my dear?" And she still held out her arms. "Dear grandmother," said Irene, "I'm not so sure I haven't done something wrong. I ought to have run up to you at once when the long-legged cat came in at the window, instead of running out of the mountain and making myself such a fright." "You were taken by surprise, my child, and you are not so likely to do it again. It is when people do wrong things wilfully that they are more likely to do them again. Come." And still she held out her arms. "But, grandmother, you're so beautiful and grand with your crown on, and I am so dirty with mud and rain, I should quite spoil your beautiful blue dress." With a merry little laugh, the lady sprung from her chair, more lightly far than Irene herself could, caught the child to her bosom, and, kissing the tear-stained face over and over, sat down with her in her lap. "Oh, grandmother, you'll make yourself such a mess!" cried Irene, clinging to her. "You darling! Do you think I care more for my dress than for my little girl? Besides, look here." As she spoke, she sat her down, and Irene saw to her dismay that the lovely dress was covered with the mud of her fall on the mountain road. But the lady stooped to the fire, and taking from it by the stalk in her fingers one of the burning roses, passed it once and again and a third time over the front of her dress, and when Irene looked, not a single stain was to be discovered. "There," said her grandmother, "you won't mind coming to me now?" But Irene again hung back, eyeing the flaming rose which the lady held in her hand. "You're not afraid of the rose, are you?" she said, about to throw it on the hearth again. "Oh, don't please," cried Irene. "Won't you hold it to my frock and my hands and my face? And I'm afraid my feet and my knees want it too." "No," answered her grandmother, smiling a little sadly, as she threw the rose from her. "It is too hot for you yet. It would set your frock in a flame. Besides, I don't want to make you clean tonight. I want your nurse and the rest of the people to see you as you are, for you will have to tell them how you ran away for fear of the long-legged cat. I should like to wash you, but they would not believe you then. Do you see that bath behind you?" The princess looked and saw a large oval tub of silver, shining brilliantly in the light of the wonderful lamp. "Go and look into it," said the lady. Irene went and came back very silent with her eyes shining. "What did you see?" asked her grandmother. "The sky and the moon and the stars," she answered. "It looked as if there was no bottom to it." The lady smiled a pleased, satisfied smile, and was silent also for a few moments. Then she said, "Any time you want a bath, come to me. I know you have a bath every morning, but sometimes you want one at night too." "Thank you, grandmother. I will indeed," answered Irene, and was again silent for some moments thinking. Then she said, "How was it, grandmother, that I saw your beautiful lamp, not the light of it only, but the great round silvery lamp itself, hanging alone in the great open air high up? It was your lamp I saw, wasn't it?" "Yes, my child, it was my lamp." "Then how was it? I don't see a window all around." "When I please, I can make the lamp shine through the walls, shine so strong that it melts them away from before the sight, and shows itself as you saw it. But, as I told you, it is not everybody can see it." "How is it that I can see it then? I'm sure I don't know." "It is a gift born with you, and one day I hope everybody will have it." "But how do you make it shine through the walls?" "Ah, that you would not understand if I were to try ever so much to make you. Not yet, not yet. But," added the lady, rising, "you must sit in my chair while I get you the present I have been preparing for you. I told you my spinning was for you. It is finished now, and I am going to fetch it. I have been keeping it warm under one of my brooding pigeons." Irene sat down in the low chair, and her grandmother left her, shutting the door behind her. The child sat gazing, now at the rose fire, now at the starry walls, now at the silver light, and a great quietness grew in her heart. If all the long-legged cats in the world had come rushing at her then, she would not have been afraid of them for a moment. How this was she could not tell. She only knew there was no fear in her, and everything was so right and safe that it could not get in. She had been gazing at the lovely lamp for some minutes fixedly. Turning her eyes, she found the wall had vanished, for she was looking out on the dark, cloudy night. But though she heard the wind blowing, none of it blew upon her. In a moment more the clouds themselves parted, or rather vanished, like the wall, and she looked straight into the starry herds, flashing gloriously in the dark blue. It was but for a moment. The clouds gathered again and shut out the stars, and the walls gathered again and shut out the clouds, and there stood the lady beside her, with the loveliest smile on her face, and a shimmering ball in her hand, about the size of a pigeon's egg. "There, Irene, there is my work for you," she said, holding out the ball to the princess. She took it in her hand and looked at it all over. It sparkled a little and shone here and there, but not much. It was a sort of gray whiteness, something like spun glass. "Is this all your spinning, grandmother?" she asked. "All since you came to the house. There is more than you think." "How pretty it is! What am I to do with it, please?" "That I will now explain to you," answered the lady, turning from her and going to her cabinet. She came back with a small ring in her hand. Then she took the ball from Irene's and did something with the ring. Irene could not tell what. "Give me your hand," she said. Irene held up her right hand. "Yes, that is the hand I want," said the lady, and put the ring on the forefinger of it. "What a beautiful ring!" said Irene. "What is the stone called?" "It is a fire opal." "Please, am I to keep it?" "Always." "Oh, thank you, grandmother. It is prettier than anything I ever saw, except those of all colors in your... Please, is that your crown?" "Yes, it is my crown. The stone in your ring is of the same sort, only not so good. It has only red, but mine have all colors, you see." "Yes, grandmother, I will take such good care of it. But," she added, hesitating. "But what?" asked her grandmother. "What am I to say when Ludy asks me where I got it?" "You will ask her where you got it," answered the lady, smiling. "I don't see how I can do that." "You will, though." "Of course I will, if you say so. But, you know, I can't pretend not to know." "Of course not. But don't trouble yourself about it. You will see when time comes." So saying, the lady turned and threw the little ball into the rose fire. "Oh, grandmother!" exclaimed Irene. "I thought you had spun it for me." "So I did, my child. And you've got it." "No, it's burnt in the fire." The lady put her hand in the fire, brought out the ball, glimmering as before, and held it towards her. Irene stretched out her hand to take it, but the lady turned and, going to her cabinet, opened a drawer and laid the ball in it. "Have I done anything to vex you, grandmother?" said Irene pitifully. "No, my darling. But you must understand that no one gives anything to another properly and really without keeping it. That ball is yours." "Oh, I'm not to take it with me? You're going to keep it for me?" "You are to take it with you. I fastened the end of it to the ring on your finger." Irene looked at the ring. "I can't see it there, grandmother," she said. "Feel a little way from the ring, towards the cabinet," said the lady. "Oh, I do feel it!" exclaimed the princess. "But I can't see it," she added, looking close to her outstretched hand. "No, the thread is too fine for you to see it. You can only feel it. Now you can fancy how much spinning that took, although it does seem like such a little ball." "But what use can I make of it if it lies in your cabinet?" "That is what I will explain to you. It would be of no use to you. It wouldn't be yours at all if it did not lie within my cabinet. Now listen. If you were to ever find yourself in any danger, such, for example, as you were in this same evening, you must take off your ring and put it under the pillow of your bed. Then you must lay your finger, the same that wore the ring, upon the thread, and follow the thread wherever it leads you." "Oh, how delightful! It will lead me to you, grandmother, I know." "Yes, but remember, it may seem to you a very roundabout way indeed, and you must not doubt the thread. Of one thing you may be sure, that while you hold it, I hold it too." "It is very wonderful," said Irene thoughtfully. Then, suddenly becoming aware, she jumped up, crying, "Oh, grandmother, here I have been sitting all this time in your chair, and you standing. I beg your pardon." The lady laid her hand on her shoulder and said, "Sit down again, Irene. Nothing pleases me better than to see anyone sit in my chair. I am only too glad to stand, so long as anyone will sit in it." "How kind of you," said the princess, and sat down again. "It makes me happy," said the lady. "But," said Irene, still puzzled, "won't the thread get in somebody's way and be broken if the other end is fast to my ring and the other laid in your cabinet?" "You will find all that arrange itself. I am afraid it is time for you to go." "Mightn't I stay and sleep with you tonight, grandmother?" "No, not tonight. If I had meant you to stay tonight, I should have given you a bath. But you must know everybody in the house is miserable about you, and it would be cruel to keep them so all night. You must go downstairs." "I'm so glad, grandmother, you didn't say, 'Go home,' for this is my home. Mayn't I call this my home?" "You may, my child, and I trust you will always think it your home. Now come, I must take you back without anyone seeing you." "Please, I want to ask you one question more," said Irene. "Is it because you have your crown that you look so young?" "No, child," answered her grandmother. "It is because I felt so young this evening that I put my crown on, and I thought you would like to see your old grandmother in her best." "Why do you call yourself old? You're not old, grandmother." "I am very old indeed. It is so silly of people. I don't mean you, for you are such a tiny and couldn't know better. But it is so silly of people to fancy that old age means crookedness and witheredness and feebleness and sticks and spectacles and rheumatism and forgetfulness. It is so silly. Old age has nothing whatever to do with all that. The right old age means strength and beauty and mirth and courage and clear eyes and strong, painless limbs. I am older than you are able to think." "And look at you, grandmother!" cried Irene, jumping up and flinging her arms about her neck. "I won't be so silly again, I promise you. At least, I'm rather afraid to promise. But if I am, I promise to be sorry for it, I do. I wish I were as old as you, grandmother. I don't think you are ever afraid of anything." "Not for long, at least, my child. Perhaps by the time I am 2,000 years of age, I shall indeed never be afraid of anything. But I confess I have sometimes been afraid about my children. Sometimes about you, Irene." "Oh, I'm so sorry, grandmother. Tonight, I suppose you mean?" "Yes, a little tonight, but a good deal when you had all but made up your mind that I was a dream, and no real great-great-grandmother. You must not suppose I am blaming you for that. I dare say you could not help it." "I don't know, grandmother," said the princess, beginning to cry. "I can't always do myself as I should like, and I don't always try. I am very sorry, anyhow." The lady stooped, lifted her in her arms, and sat down with her in her chair, holding her close to her bosom. In a few minutes the princess had sobbed herself to sleep. How long she slept I do not know. When she came to herself, she was sitting in her own high chair at the nursery table, with her doll's house before her. Chapter 16. The Ring. The same moment her nurse came into the room, sobbing. When she saw her sitting there, she started back with a loud cry of amazement and joy. Then, running to her, she caught her in her arms and covered her with kisses. "My precious darling princess, where have you been? What has happened to you? We've all been crying our eyes out and searching the house from top to bottom for you." "Not quite from the top," thought Irene to herself, and she might have added, not quite to the bottom, perhaps, if she had known all. But the one she would not, and the other she could not say. "Oh, Ludi, I've had such a dreadful adventure," she replied, and told her all about the cat with the long legs, and how she ran out upon the mountain and came back again. But she said nothing of her grandmother or her lamp. "And there we've been searching for you all over the house for more than an hour and a half," exclaimed the nurse. "But that's no matter. Now we've got you. Only, Princess, I must say," she added, her mood changing, "what you ought to have done was to call for your own Ludi to come and help you, instead of running out of the house and up the mountain in that wild, I must say, foolish fashion." "Well, Ludi," said Irene quietly, "perhaps if you had a big cat, all legs, running at you, you might not exactly know what was the wisest thing to do at the moment." "I wouldn't have run up the mountain anyhow," returned Ludi. "Not if you had time to think about it. But when those creatures came at you that night on the mountain, you were so frightened yourself that you lost your way home." This put a stop to Ludi's reproaches. She had been on the point of saying that the long-legged cat must have been a twilight fancy of the princess's, but the memory of the horrors of that night, and the talking to which the king had given her in consequence, prevented her from saying what, after all, she did not half believe, having a strong suspicion that the cat was a goblin, for she knew nothing of the difference between the goblins and their creatures. She counted them all just goblins. Without another word, she went and got some fresh tea and bread and butter for the princess. Before she had returned, the whole household, headed by the housekeeper, burst into the nursery to exult over their darling. The gentlemen-at-arms followed, and were ready enough to believe all she told them about the long-legged cat. Indeed, though wise enough to say nothing about it, they remembered, with no little horror, just such a creature amongst those they had surprised at their gambols upon the princess's lawn. In their own hearts they blamed themselves for not having kept better watch, and their captain gave orders that from this night the front door and all the windows on the ground floor should be locked immediately the sun set, and opened after upon no pretense whatever. The men-at-arms redoubled their vigilance, and for some time there was no further cause of alarm. When the princess woke the next morning, her nurse was bending over her. "How your ring does glow this morning, princess! Just like a fiery rose," she said. "Does it, Ludi?" returned Irene. "Who gave me the ring, Ludi? I know I had it a long time, but where did I get it? I don't remember." "I think it must have been your mother gave it to you, princess. But really, for as long as you have worn it, I don't remember that I have ever heard," answered her nurse. "I will ask my King Papa the next time he comes," said Irene.
We hope you enjoy listening to this episode of the Enchanted Stories Podcast. The text of the stories shared on this podcast are in the public domain. This recording, however, is property of the Enchanted Stories Podcast. Any use or reproduction of this recording is strictly prohibited without the express written permission of Russell J. Fellows.